This is the Efficiency Equation, a show for plant managers spilling hard-earned wisdom and secrets in the search for the efficiency code in liquid manufacturing. I'm Konstantin, together here with Eugene, and today we're hosted by Den Rennie. Let's dive in.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 6 of the Efficiency Equation podcast. And today we have one of the trickier topics, a somewhat technical topic, which is lot control, something which is very special when it comes to liquids and bulk liquids, as opposed to packaged goods. I'd just like to welcome both of you, Eugene and Konstantin. Please take us through what is so special about lot control when it comes to manufacturing execution.
The first question for those people who might be wondering why we're even talking about this is, what is lot control? Just real quick. So if you're making the same product and you are making it in different batches, so first you have a batch of product and then the same equipment might make another batch of another product, but then during the same day maybe, or whenever you're making that first product again, companies attach what's called a lot number to that product that they made, so that when they look at everything they have in the inventory, they might have a lot of different batches of the same product, but they were made as part of different efforts. And that is important to distinguish, because now you might have worked on that first batch and everything was configured correctly, and that's a perfect batch. But the second time you worked on the other batch, you might have introduced some kind of issue with either a wrong configuration setting, some kind of contamination. So in the food and beverage industry, this is very important to make sure that whatever you have for the same product, you can identify each individual batch that you made, and that goes to traceability. You have to be able to trace for regulatory compliance. Also, things like shelf life, you have to check that you might have some batches of your product that are already older than others, and then you have to recheck to see if they've gone bad. So things like this. But inventory management at that micro level becomes important. So that's the lot control in essence. And the concept of lot control means that through your process, as you make the same product again, there is that identifier that moves along with it in your production steps. And so when we get to bulk liquid manufacturing, it becomes even more interesting.
How does lot control come into the picture when it comes to compliance, regulatory stuff, storage? Well, it comes into the picture that you need to be able to trace every individual component that goes into the product that you make. Obviously, regulatory rules will be different for different products. Like if you're making toilet paper, there's one set of rules. If you're making food items that are for human consumption, then there's a different set of regulatory rules that you have to follow in terms of tracing every component. If you're working on the baby formula, for example, then you have even stricter rules of regulations that you need to apply. And it all comes down to how strict the rules are and how much traceability you need in the end to be able to follow every product down to its most basic components and say where those components came from, how they came to be, what equipment they went through, potentially what vendors provided those components to you, because in some cases you may need to recall some products, right? Because of some defect in some component. How do you know which product is affected by that defect? You need to be able to trace it down to each individual component and see where that component went into, right? Which products and which customers received that product from you in the end. You have to notify all of them and to be able to collect all the information about the product that went out. Without lot control, that's very, very hard to do, if not impossible. Yeah. And when it comes to bulk liquids, what sets this vertical apart from other areas of manufacturing? So why is bulk liquid manufacturing special when it comes to lot control? It's special due to the fact that it's not made out of discrete parts that you can pull apart. Liquids are by nature mixing. And when you add bulk to it, meaning that it's high volume liquids, it's hard to maintain a trace of what mixed with what at what time, especially when there are certain physical constraints on the blend, when you have to mix things in some kind of storage and products are going in as the mix is coming out. That is a special headache issue to deal with because you are really having like a big pipe instead of a storage. Product is coming in and it's coming out at the same time. You don't know exactly what's happening. Plus, every time you transfer a liquid from one storage into another, that liquid is going through some kind of piping and it's in contact with that piping. Do you know what came through that pipes for those pipes before? You have to know that, right? Do you know what's in the other storage where the liquid is going to end up? Is it going to end up on top of some other product in there? Or maybe it's the same product, but it was made in a different batch. So now you have a mixing of what was in the tank before with what's coming into the tank now. So those things are hard to track and it's much harder to deal with than with individual parts. When you're making, let's say, a clock radio, it's very clear as to what you need to track. Every part has a vendor, has a lot number. And if there's a problem with that part, you know specifically where that part went into because it's discrete. It doesn't mix with anything. It stays the same as it was every time you use it. If it's a transistor that you have to put into a piece of electronics, it's going to be that transistor everywhere. It's not going to become something else, right? It's not going to mix with anything. With liquids, the main problem is this mixing, right? Because it's not a discrete thing. You cannot contain it and say, that's my part. It's liquid. Commingling is the big issue. And contamination also. The transistor is not going to rub off of something and become something else, right? It's still going to be that transistor. The liquids can get contaminated easily, right? If they mix with a small amount of something that should never have been there, then it becomes an issue.
One thing I wanted to add to that is the mixing when there's a little bit of product left over. So in this industry with bulk liquids, the companies already know which products are okay to dilute with other products and which products are not. And so very frequently when they empty out a tank, the storage tank, it will not be completely empty. So there'll be a little bit left. And then the new product is being pumped on top of that. And in terms of then going back and having to trace all of this. So if there is a mock product recall, a real product recall, any kind of forensic analysis exercise, you then have to see how much of that specific product that you're interested in went where else did it go downstream, you know? And the issue here is that because in a lot of cases, we will have a small quantity left over in the tank. If you're just tracing straight in a straightforward fashion, you'll have a near infinite trace because that just keeps getting into a tank. There's another product being added on top. And so now the old product is absorbed into the new product and there's your trace. And that keeps repeating. So the tricks in this particular industry, they become very specific where you then have to say, okay, I have to stop doing this at some point where the product is already diluted enough that I don't care about the residuals going forward anymore. So there's unique challenges with that in this industry.
Okay, for someone new to lock control, this sounds like the worst nightmare when it comes to tracking all of this and add compliance to this. So how do companies manage this without a system? Because I assume that there's software for that and that will do its job. But when you don't have a special system, like how I, I'm thinking about humongous Excel sheets and whatnot. So what have you seen companies do?
Yes, it's exactly that. It's spreadsheets on paper, and what you see is two things in there. First, we've seen spreadsheets where there were these inconsistent lot numbering practices, where it was some kind of number sequential number even maybe, but it wasn't applied consistently. And the issue with handling that kind of lot numbering manually is that consistency is key. And when you do it manually, you make mistakes. So that's just something that we observed when we sat down with production planners and asked them to explain what is here. How did you get to this point in the schedule? And then they try to explain the lot sequence and they start making corrections in the schedule right in front of you. So we've seen that. The other thing that is a little bit more straightforward, but prone to a lot of problems is using date-based lots. So people will say, if I made this product on this date, that date becomes my lot number. And it makes it easier to understand how to apply that kind of lot numbering, but it creates its own issues because you could be making you could be making the same product multiple times that day. And so then if the customer comes and says, oh, this product, that lot is contaminated, there's an issue. So then what do you do? Which of those do you isolate for quarantine and investigate? And we've actually seen that ends up forcing companies to isolate and quarantine much greater volume of product than they could have quarantined just because of the lot numbering rules. So it's a greater volume at risk. They have to isolate everything they did that day. They have to do investigations and check what can be done with that. Does that entire volume of product need to be completely recycled, or something can be done to fix things? It depends on the degree of the problem. But date-based lots in general, they create this area of ambiguity, and it's down to a day, but a lot of things can happen within a day. So that's some of the stuff we've seen.
The other thing I was wondering about is if tracking and tracing all of this is a nightmare. Have you seen it happen that manufacturing plants would impose strict rules on what product can come after another, just so that the tracing of lot numbers doesn't become a huge mess? I don't know if the question makes sense. So wait, let me try to say it in another way. So does tracking and tracing become a bottleneck in production, meaning that you would be able to deliver something and produce something, but because it would complicate the tracking so much and you wouldn't be able to assure proper traces and tracking, and so you wouldn't necessarily be able to be compliant, then you refuse doing that and just go back to doing things in a more rigid way.
No, actually, what we see is in a lot of cases, people at the site first do something and then try to figure out after the fact how to unwind it. So they're not going to stop producing just because something doesn't match with the lots in a lot of cases. So there are projects where the product or the process is so sensitive that the customer would ask, please help us make sure that there are certain stops put in the process when something doesn't match. Yes. But if they didn't ask for that, the default is that they keep going. And so you sort of fly with it and hope that overall, over most of your products, you didn't mess this up too bad too frequently. And so then later, when you come to try to trace what happened, that's where the issues come up. So they're usually after the fact, but I would say in a lot of cases, because of what we said with the unique challenges of liquids, while the operators are making things happen, they're not bogged down by the individual details of lot control. So they'll be like, okay, this is what I'm doing. I'm taking this from here, putting it here. Let's go. And at that moment, they might like pick something wrong or correct, but usually they don't stop. So the issues happen later when something goes wrong or the auditor comes and they ask you, okay, what happened here? And then you have to unwind exactly what the operators did. But unless it's a sensitive area, there is this view that you don't want to create too much churn with very rigid processes. You want to make sure that there's some kind of balance between the level of granularity of checks and balances and just like the factory's ability to keep producing. So if you introduce too much in terms of checks and balances, then they're going to stop. And that's not wanted by anybody. They can't make any money that way. So it's a little gray area there.
This situation you brought up does happen, but not because of lot control. It happens because of product incompatibility. When there's certain products that should not be ever mixed with other products, then you have to plan for producing certain things and not others and put those constraints on your plan. Because if they have to go through the same pieces of equipment or same piping, then, and they cannot mix, then you have to make sure that you do them in a certain sequence that prevents that kind of mixing. But it's not due to the lot control. Okay. And what have you seen the biggest challenge be in lot control? By the way, one thing I haven't asked is who is typically responsible for this? So who owns lot control at a typical plant?
That's a good question. It's also a little bit of a gray area, and I'll explain why. Because you have two modes of operation. You have make to stock and you have just in time production. And in just in time, you may have something where the lots are planned. So production planners, when they create the schedule, when they use a system for it, or when they try to do it in the spreadsheet, we've seen both. They would say that I'm creating this sequence of steps. First, you process the product this way, then you process it that way. And then, so it's like a Gantt chart. But in that Gantt chart, they are already prescribing lot numbers because that is their level of inventory management where they can plan for a certain order, customer order, to be picked up on a certain day and certain time without having to wait until those steps are actually made, until they're completed. So there would be planned lots. And then when the operators actually execute, sometimes things don't happen the way they were planned. And then something got delayed and tank 1, 2, 3 maybe had a different lot in it. So in those cases, the actual lot sequence changes from what it was when it was planned. And so now to go back to your question, you have lot numbering at the level of production planners when they create the schedule, which may or may not exist at certain sites. And then you always have the lot numbering on the execution side where the operators say, okay, it's this lot number that I'm using right now. And so that ownership may be split. It may be on execution side, but it's one of those things where if you walk into a plant, into a control room maybe, and ask this question, who owns lot numbering in this facility? You'll hear crickets. A lot of times you'll hear crickets because nobody really wants to own it because it's one of those things that is just not too straightforward. So that's what we see.
Yeah. Okay. And one of the most exciting parts of this podcast is when you guys bring your horror stories. So I'm betting that you have some experiences that are not very positive when it comes to lot control and lot numbering that you come across. And I'm sure people would love to hear these and learn from them. So there's one that I already kind of mentioned before in this conversation, and that is the situation when the storage tank is used for ins and outs at the same time. You can call it a pass-through storage, right? Or maybe it's not really a pass-through, it's just being used that way. What that is if you have a big storage and you use that storage to feed your equipment, right? With some kind of raw material or intermediate product. And while you're doing that, while you are feeding the product out of that storage into an equipment, you're also putting new product, maybe the same one that's in the storage, on top of that, of whatever's in the storage already. That creates the situation of this pass-through tank storage kind of, right? Meaning that you never know what's in that storage at any given time because you never seal the output when you're doing the input, and you never seal the input while you're doing the output from that storage. That creates an issue whenever you want to come back and trace what happened to a specific product. If you want to do some kind of a, let's say, audit trace because you were asked to do an audit during some audit exercise, or maybe it's a recall that you need to follow back to the raw material to find out where it went. Maybe it's a mock recall, right? Something that you're just doing for the exercise purposes, and it happens to be a product that went through that pass through tank storage. The horror story begins when you get to that tank and you're saying, what is it that we put in there? What was in the tank when we pumped the product out of it into this equipment? Well, you don't know because you were also pumping the product into that tank at the same time. And that becomes an issue. Even with good lot control in place, saying you have a system that does a good job with controlling the lots, it's still hard to track it because now you have to get down to individual times and think, okay, was I really pumping into this tank at that time? If I was, what can I tell you about what was in the tank? It was whatever was there, and then whatever I was putting on top of it. It's a mix of the two. So now if you do have to recall, you just exposed yourself for a much larger volume of product, right? Because you cannot just say it was just what's in the tank. That's the problem, right? You have to now open it up and say, well, since I was also feeding the product into the tank at the same time, it's also all of that volume that is in the other tank that I'm feeding from. And that could be a huge volume by itself. So you now expose yourself to all of the sum of all those volumes. So that's a big issue. If a recall happens or an audit trace is required for a situation like that, it can create quite a headache for everybody to be able to track that. So the best thing to do is to avoid it so that your plant does not use this practice of going in and going out of the tank at the same time. But if you cannot avoid it, then you're dealing with this issue knowingly that if things come up and this particular tank becomes a source of audit, you will have an issue.
I was also thinking about this story that just keeps repeating, and for various reasons at different sites, but reusing the same lot number across multiple storage containers. It's one thing that directly contributes to increasing risk whenever anything goes wrong. So we see this in places that use date-based lots because, look, you might have had your product A in tank 1, then you pumped it to tank 2 on the same date. Now, it's still product A, but it's in a different tank. If you're using date-based lots, it's still the same date, same lot number. But while you were doing that pumping, you might have introduced contamination. So we see that. And why is that an issue? Because again, I'm going back to my earlier point that the value of product at risk is very high when you use this practice. What should be happening in ideal world is that each time you move the product from one place to another place where you can introduce problems, you change the lot number. So then whenever somebody does say that there's an issue, you can go back and find exactly that amount of product that had a problem. But if you're just reusing the same number, it stays. And then there are other sites where they are not using date-based lot numbering, but they're already using much more granular sequence-based lot numbering. So if you're making a product on the same piece of equipment, you might have like an equipment code in there, but then there would be just a sequential number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it just keeps growing until the end of the year or longer. And so when that is used, it is more granular and it is better. You can isolate issues with greater precision, but in some cases, sites make a conscious decision to circumvent that practice of assigning a new lot number every time they move something. And in some cases, they'll say, yeah, when I'm done in this greater factory with producing this finished product, and now I'm just like pumping it out, and maybe I'm doing some packaging into smaller containers. But oh, by the way, while I'm pumping it there to the packaging site, I'm also going through another pass-through tank. And they would package the product, but use the lot number that was there when they first generated the huge batch of it. So when that happens, if your customer comes back and says, there is a problem with this, now you're having to quarantine that entire huge amount of product that was in that big tank before you started pumping out. However, if you use the lot numbers as the product kept moving out, if the customer says something is wrong, you first start with that smaller batch, you check your samples, and maybe the issue will be resolved at that point, and then you've just saved yourself the headache of having to quarantine everything else and to do a recall potentially on that. Maybe not. Maybe you will go from that small batch to the next iteration up the chain. But generally, that approach will eliminate a lot of unnecessary risk. And so that's the horror story, that when plants use the same lot number on things repetitively, then you don't know at which point they might have introduced a problem. So a lot of times it just goes unnoticed because nobody complained about a problem. But when there is a problem, you have all of that product that you now need to isolate. So that's a pretty big one.
Yeah. If you think about it, like imagine that you made 1,000,000 pounds of some kind of product into one tank, and then you moved 10,000 out of that million into another tank, and you're using date-based lots, meaning your lot was your date. So now you started shipping and you ship the product and it's long gone. And then somebody comes back and says, hey, there's a problem. And you look into a problem and you realize that it's a big problem that you need to act upon. All right. Well, did it come from that second tank where there was only 10,000 pounds of product, or did it come from the 1,000,000 pounds? You don't know. It might have been the 10,000 because there was some contamination in that tank, and that's what got the product into the state of recall. But now you don't know that anymore. Now you have to recall the whole 1,000,000 pounds because all you have is a date.
And one thing just from a personal experience in my daily life, after dealing with the lot control at work, I started paying attention to food product packaging for everyday things that we buy at the store. And I was showing to my kids, whenever they cared about it, that you can actually see who's got things under control and who may be under doubt. Because when you pick up a food product at the grocery store, the stuff we're talking about with lots, it will be printed on there. And usually, if it's some kind of pre-made packaging, there'll be like a white rectangle and then stuff printed in it. Or maybe it's a carton of milk you pick up and you look at the bottom, there's stuff printed. And very frequently, you can tell if it's a date-based lot or if it's a sequential lot that looks like something complicated. There would be like a mix of letters and numbers. And where you see that mix of letters and numbers, that is my bet where people have it more under control than where you just see a date. So that's just a
That's a good one.
little snippet.
Next thing I'm doing now is going out to the kitchen and checking all the boxes of cereal. And then I'm going to
Yes,
start trusting the foods more that have like more serious lot numbers.
yes, absolutely.
I'm not going to buy any of the ones that use dates.
Yep.
Remember, Konstantin mentioned when you move the product from one storage to another storage and then to another storage, you want to be able to track that with assigning new lot numbers so that if you introduce contamination as you move it, you know where that happened, right? Just the analogy of, does that happen with regular discrete lot control? If you take a transistor and move it from one box to another, did it change? It did not. It's the same transistor, right? So that's how things are different between the different processes. So in liquid, it is potentially a different liquid because it might have contaminated itself with whatever was in the tank or in the piping when you were transferring, right? With a little part like a transistor, it didn't contaminate itself. Nothing happened to it. You just moved it from one box to another box, right? So, okay, nothing happened. You don't need to create a new lot number. You don't need to track that in any special way. It's the same transistor. Those are the big differences there. And have you guys had anything to do with audits? So what happens when an auditor comes and they want answers? They probably don't want answers. They want to look at stuff and they want you to tell them. So how does that work? What does an auditor look for?
Yeah, so we've had some experience helping our clients during the audits, and we didn't sit down with the auditors directly to do this, but we were on standby in a different location, providing information when needed. And you can get different auditors that request different degrees of detail, but generally for the food industry, you have a certain time frame. And in that time frame, you have to show that you got everything under control. So they'll pick a random customer order maybe and ask you to go back and show all of the iterations of how you got, like how the product got to that customer order, what were all the different lots, what were all the different intermediate products, and you have to trace it all the way up to the raw materials or ingredients that you purchased from your suppliers. So all the way out. And you can say then that this is how this got in here. And by the way, the same trace is used when there is a real problem, when there's a recall. They go up that tree and check at each stage what could there have been an issue, and they frequently have retained samples of products so they can find out. Or maybe they will just look because they already had quality control samples tested. They'll go up the chain and find certain data that tells them that this is where the problem occurred. Or maybe they'll go all the way up to the supplier and say the supplier shipped us a problematic product, whatever may be the case. But the auditors will ask for that, or they may pick something in the middle of your production chain and say, show me the trace forward and backward. So backward to the supplier and forward, basically saying, what are all the customer orders or stock orders where this product was used? And then you have only a certain amount of time to produce a good story where you know exactly what happened. And then if the auditor goes and checks physical inventory, if they can do so, they'll try to match up what you have on hand to what you're supposed to have on hand per your story with the lot trace. So that exercise in bulk liquids is especially difficult when things don't go as planned. So you're tracing, you know that the planners wanted to take this product and then pump it here and then use it on some other processing equipment, but the operators were behind schedule. And so now you have some overlap between what was intended and what actually happened. And again, just remember, I'm going back to the difference Eugene pointed out with discrete manufacturing and continuous process manufacturing. You cannot go and check physically what is it. You cannot eyeball the product. So when you have over 100 storage tanks and there is something in each one of them, you have no way, if you're in doubt, you have no way of taking a peek and saying, well, is it product A or product B? You cannot do that. You can do that in a lengthy way to maybe like take a quality sample if you shut down the factory and have your lab run some tests and based on the base ingredients tell you what that is generally. But they won't be able to tell you in a lot of cases whether that's that specific version of the product that you were making, because they'll all have a lot of commonalities. And so now, because you cannot check when you're in doubt, you have to rely on a good system of record when you're moving things from one place to another. And very frequently, people just don't get it. So we get back to the mindset conversation that you have maybe operators that don't care as much about how thorough their system of record is. That in some cases, maybe it's very clear. We picked up product here, pumped it here, and then we processed it on certain equipment. But in some other cases, they may be a little more relaxed about how things work without understanding that that relaxed attitude creates ambiguity in the records. So that's where we're going back to having the right tools, the right systems, but also having the discipline of recording everything thoroughly. Because if you don't, you're not going to be running after that tank, that product, and saying, let me do some chemical analysis to figure out what this is. But then in the example of radio that Eugene brought up before, if you're building a radio and all of a sudden you have this amnesia or whatever, and you paused, and now you're looking, what am I holding? You can identify what that is. With bulk liquids, it's all very similar. So which version of that liquid are you working with? If it got already pumped out of the tank, and so you think you're working with X, but in reality, X is in the next tank. This is Y. So that's what we're talking about. The discipline becomes very important. And it goes back to the mindset where it's not just the senior management that needs to adopt that mindset of doing things right and being meticulous about their records, but it's also the understanding among the line operators of why it's important, why they should do the best they can. And when those are aligned, the mindset and the tools, then you see fewer problems.
Again, from everything we've talked about so far in the first 5 episodes, to me at least, this is a subjective thing. Lot control sounds like the scariest thing. Would you agree with that, or what are you seeing, or is it just me that feels this way? Maybe not the scariest, but definitely one of the hardest things to do right. Yes. So there's nothing really scary about it once you have good handling on it, once you have good practices in place and you're not complicating things for yourself by saying having every storage be a pass through storage when you don't control ins and outs, they happen at the same time. If you minimize those things that can hurt you, then lot control doesn't have to be scary. So it's really down to, do you have the discipline and good practices in place that can help you excel in controlling what's happening with your products and be able to track every change of the product, whether composition or environment of the product, and not be worrying too much about any kind of recalls or audit requirements, or you're going to hurt yourself, with not following good practices and implementing roadblocks for your own self that will make this harder. So it's not really scary if you have a handle on it. So yeah, 3 things. You heard discipline, you heard good practice, meaning processes, and stuff that Konstantin keeps bumping into or coming up with or ending up with rather is mindset. And of course, they're all interrelated. What else is there that can help plant managers have an easier time with lot control and an easier time managing the processes and having the discipline and actually being able to run the show so that it doesn't end up being scary? Does technology come to the rescue?
Yes, I would say if you are trying to get in control of your lot control, use strict lot numbering rules. That's number one. So you want to make lot numbering such that you get much more precise, meaning whenever your product moves from one storage to another, you change lot numbers, and that way you're much more granular. So that's number one. That will help you minimize the risk when there is a product recall. Number two is use solutions that help you trace lots quickly. So this, of course, would be process and software. So you get tools if you don't have them, but then you have to adjust your process to make sure that those tools show you meaningful data, right? And then the third one, important one, is I'd say try not to circumvent the processes of clear traceability. So everybody knows at the plant how things should work, ideally for a given assembly line, a given piece of equipment. Try not to circumvent how it should work, because we see in some cases selectively people circumvent that because of some kind of convenience that if they just circumvent it, then they don't have to do XYZ. It's usually there to save time and money. In the long run, if you circumvent the traceability, you're going to have problems with the audit. So it's a decision to make. And number four, I would say, if you are circumventing the process somewhere and you have a good reason for it, just know that the systems then will have limitations because of what you're doing. You may not be able to do certain things. You may not be able to dig up history in a certain way that you want to. And the example Eugene brought up earlier with the pass-through tanks, If you're using pass-through tanks and then you're trying to establish clear lot traceability, good luck with that, because that tank, the pass-through tank, should not even be part of the lot trace at that point, because the lot keeps changing all the time while you have the inlet and outlet open at the same time. So things like that, I'd say strict lot numbering rules, system solutions, and the process. Do not circumvent the traceability. And if you do, just know the limitations of the tools that you got.
I think that wraps it up, ladies and gentlemen. And we talked about a lot today. Again, it's all about discipline. It's all about having the right systems and the mindset and knowing your tools. Of course, I'm oversimplifying, but it is the concluding summary of a 40 or 45-minute conversation on a real complex topic. So again, thank you so much for listening along or watching along. Feel free to subscribe and give us a rating, give a like on Spotify. Really appreciate it so that we can stay motivated and keep coming back with more content for you guys. And thank you for coming, and we are out.
Thank you. Thank you. Guys, thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you could find some valuable insights from this episode. We'll be releasing new episodes soon, so stay tuned. If you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, suggestions, or just want to chat, you can find us on LinkedIn. Links are in the description. See you next time.